I think the first issue we should address, quite frankly, is that we stand between this audience and drinks and or cannabis. So it's a tough slot, I think, at this point. But maybe we'll introduce ourselves quickly, and then we have broken down the world into three main topics, and then we'll touch on those and develop some ideas and concepts around that, and then we'll leave quite a bit of time at the end for questions, because it is about global industry, and so we're sure there's a lot of questions.
Sure, thanks, Shane. So I'm Jill Swainson, and I have spent, I guess, the last 9 years being very actively involved in cannabis. First as external counsel, and then being general counsel and chief legal officer of a publicly traded company in Canada, which had global operations. And then the past year, I've just been doing some consulting. Shane and I work together at the same company, so we have a lot of joint experience and then some separate experiences. Shane's more of a regulatory product development type person, and I always had the risk management side of the global operations.
Yeah, so my background, as Jill was saying, so first of all, I'm the most boring person in cannabis, and that's even in a room full of lawyers. My background is a PhD in molecular genetics. I don't have a Canadian accent, and by the way, we do have to apologize for your smoke issue. Sorry. But I came to Canada in 2000 from Dublin, Ireland originally, and I went into the federal government. I did very boring things in the federal government Canadian system for about 15 years. And then in 2015, I got the opportunity to have a midlife crisis, or I should say a little bit of a career change. So I helped do a startup cannabis company in 2015 under the old medical regime in Canada. And then that expanded into obviously recreational. I left that company, joined Aurora Cannabis with Jill, and I basically two roles, worked on regulatory affairs issues, not being a lawyer, but working very closely with lawyers and mainly on the policy side, and working with the federal government and provincial governments, and also other governments around the world, Germany, Australia, Ireland, and various other jurisdictions. And then in 2020, I went out on my own, and I've been doing a lot of work around the world globally on product development mainly, but also a lot of regulatory affairs, product introduction, and quite a bit of due diligence as well. And also in the last 3 years, I've had like 5 cases as an expert witness, which has been quite interesting. So quite a lot of litigation and arbitration. So that's my background, if you have not fallen asleep already.
So one of the things we were asked to focus on was a little bit about not just the legal side, as we're all lawyers in this room, but also the commercial side and what we've seen from working within a business. We're going to talk a little bit about where things were 5 years ago and where things are now in terms of business priorities and what we're seeing, both, I guess, when we speak domestically, we're speaking more so about Canada, but more so on the global perspective. So we will talk a little bit about how things have changed over time, and that's just based on economic circumstances and what we've seen based on company priorities. So, Shane, do you want to start?
Yeah, so we decided to break up into 3 kind of areas because we are digesting the global industry at this point. We thought we'd touch a bit of the issues around IP globally and what we're seeing in different jurisdictions around the world. Then we wanted to touch on the medical side and show different jurisdictional approaches on the medical aspect. And then obviously the recreational side and where we're seeing things go and the different regulatory frameworks and policy initiatives that are often coming out of medical, but some are actually moving on their own from a recreational and consumer use perspective.
Okay, so with that, we'll get right into the IP side of things, because that was a specific question that we were asked when we were putting this panel together. So I can say that for certainty, back in 2016, 2017, a lot of the Canadian companies made a big run for filing for a ton of different trademarks for a lot of different brands. Whatever they could think of, they tried to get trademark protection in Canada. Since then, a lot of them have scaled back quite a bit for a number of reasons, one being budgetary, and two being that a lot of the brands that they filed for never got used, plans changed, or never took off. What we're seeing on a global perspective is it is valuable to license your brands internationally. However, it's very difficult as well to get the actual value out of them in a lot of places. And that's due to basically regulatory conventions in each jurisdiction and the rules and restrictions. So, Shane, you want to talk about Canada and the regulatory restrictions with branding?
Yeah. So, first of all, we're fully aware that there's, great IP sessions in this conference, and also a fantastic IP session that's going to be in Montreal that Jason will be running in September. But from the perspective of, brands and what you can do, there's been a couple of cases where you've seen US brands come to Canada. They obviously, Wine is a great example, Grown's another example, there's a number of examples, but you've seen them be able to protect themselves from a trademark perspective, but that trademark sometimes has to change depending on what you can do, or those marks have to change depending on what you do in relation to your actual market allowability in, for example, Canada. It's very restrictive. It's as close. It's not plain packaging, but it's pretty close. You're basically like two colors. Regulated text size, placement, ratios in relation to colors and sizes. So your ability to, you may have great trademarks, but your ability to use them commercially successfully is really stunted in Canada. And then of course, when you go around the world, it's very hard to take some of those trademarks and apply them in the medical space. A great example is cookies and their Israeli pharmacy, which was reported not so long ago. So I think there's some real challenges, and cookies, for example, is another great example in Canada that's really been great brand, good trademarks in the US, but not very useful in the Canadian marketplace.
And then also just with flexibility in additional markets such as Australia, Germany, Poland, and those types of places. When you register a product, quite often you have to commit to a name at that point. And you're basically stuck with that for a long time unless you essentially re-register the product, which can take months, if not a year or so to do. So once you're in a certain market, you often stick with that branding, even if it's not what you have back home where the product's originating from.
Yeah, so, from a trademark perspective, I think there's lots to be said. From a patent perspective, which is obviously much different, my clients and the conversations I'm having globally, it's important to have protection, but, to maintain a patent. So, for example, one of my clients has a very good patent portfolio in relation to next generation inhalation or beyond inhalation products. In negotiations they're having with potential investors, they obviously want to see that, but then there's big questions about being able, if you're a small company, startup, being able to maintain that patent in all the jurisdictions you want to make yourself attractive to a potential investor or buyer. It's a very expensive process. We were just reviewing recently a use of proceeds and investment opportunity for an investment opportunity, and 40% of the use of proceeds was going to go into patent maintenance. Not even new patents, just patent maintenance on that. So that's another key aspect commercially, and where I think you're seeing some IP protection drop off globally, because you've got to have to pick your winners. You can't be maintaining patents globally. It's a very expensive endeavor.
And then that leads us to plants and the genetics side. So, a number of years ago, there are a lot of companies that always said, we have the best genetics. How many times have we heard that? Everybody says that, right? There were some applications for what's called plant breeders' rights in Canada, where you basically submit a specimen to the governing agency. But what we found throughout that is, and that also happens internationally in Europe as well, or it can in some jurisdictions, but what we found is a lot of the applications that were made by many companies, by the time they actually submit their specimen and actually get protection, suddenly that strain is obsolete. There's so much change, there's so much crossbreeding and changeover that what's important today is not going to be important quite often in, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. So we've seen it, I would say, like, from what I'm aware of, probably a reduction or a slowdown, at least what's been applied for from the plant side in terms of strain characteristics. However, on the scientific side, I think that might be, probably maintaining in terms of characteristics such as like powdery mildew and those types of things.
Yeah, as a plant geneticist, I won't get too deep into this because I will put you to sleep 100%. I think one area is you're seeing on the plant genetic side, so medical market globally, some very important markets, in Canada, there's quite a lot of exports to Germany, Australia, for example, multi-million dollars per quarter of product. What we're seeing there, though, is that you have to register the strain, and I use that term abhorrently as a geneticist, so forgive me, but let's go with the colloquial. That strain with the regulated agencies from a medical perspective, and it has a very tight requirement, under EU GMP and the specification that the regulator will want to see on a repeated basis going into a medical channel. The problem with that is once you do that, it's hard to change. You're locking yourself into that strain. But at the same time, you've got competing commercial interests back home, for example, in Canada, where the recreational consumer wants something new, wants something sexy. Gorilla Glue 1 week, Tangerine Dream the next week, and then, cherry something the week after. Those two kind of supply chain issues don't match. So, while you've invested heavily in protecting, your question becomes, do you invest in your plant breeders' rights across all your strains? Because some of them are transitory, or some of them are much more, long-term investments in your medical export market globally. The other aspect that I'd like to touch on is biotech and transgenic and so-called transgenic. There's, non-transgenic modern biotechnology as well, which is funny because you can get strains called GMO in cannabis quite happily, which as someone who worked in the space is interesting because it's always the organic GMO people. It's just very bizarre. But the idea is that now you can have, we're at the very beginning of applying agricultural biotechnology to cannabis. Really, there's such low-hanging fruit. If you talk to the corn guys or the canola guys or the wheat guys, they just salivate at what's possible to be able to do in a cannabis landscape because so little has been done because we took it out of basements and we took it out of illegal grows. As you're looking at biotechnology and technology applications in modern day to be able to apply to something like powdery mildew, to flowering time, to size, to terpene profile. It's just, such low-hanging fruit. You'll probably see IP protection on those plant traits as you move forward using what we have as modern, innovative, and being able to show from a patent and from a plant breeders' rights perspective that innovation into cannabis plants. How valuable that is will remain to be seen because we're not dealing with the same scale as corn, wheat, and different growing areas. So I think from an agronomic perspective, there might be different pressures, but it will be fascinating to watch as we move forward, in this space on a global perspective, who's protecting what new plant agricultural biotechnology for cannabis. I don't know.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the medical markets that we're seeing emerge around the world. So we've learned a few things over the past, 8 years or so. Number one is medical markets will emerge, but they will emerge way slower than we think. There's some transactions that I'm looking back on from 2016 to 2017 that I was a part of, and they're literally just starting to pay off from 2020 onwards. So in terms of the markets actually picking up and the regulations being developed and those types of things, I don't think we ever anticipated it would take that long. And those are in the faster developing countries such as Germany. So I think that's step number one on the globalization of cannabis. It's happening, but it's slow, and that's no matter what jurisdiction it's in.
Yeah, I think it's worth your while going back and looking at jurisdictional progress in other in countries around the globe. I would recommend having a look at Australia, where the market there has been slow to grow. There's two aspects of that. You've got a growth curve that needs to return on investment, that needs to make sense commercially when you're expanding into new global markets. And the second part of that is you're going to see regulatory and I would say quality changes. So Australia is a great example. You've got a situation where in Australia, early days, there was a great demand by the TGA, the Australian regulator, to have patient access to medical cannabis. It started very, very slow. It was very bureaucratic. Basically, a doctor on a per patient basis had to get TGA approval, and that could take 4 to 5 days. Now, it's so evolved that it's a matter of 4 or 5 minutes, and it's on an online database, and it's super quick for a doctor to be able to prescribe.
There's limited conditions before.
Yeah, there's limited conditions. It's humorous because I'm involved in another venture that we're seeing the same thing happening now from July 1st for MDMA and psilocybin in Australia as well. So July 1st, they're going to have an opportunity for those molecules. But going back to cannabis, early days was very slow, heavy investment, and they were also accepting what I would argue as kind of carve-outs on a quality basis. So you had to show not GMP, and I'm talking EU GMP, no offense to American GMP, but I've been to some facilities in the US that claim to be GMP. Humorous is one way of putting it. You had a system where they were very lax, I would say, in what they would accept, and as a result, it was able to grow the market, get access, and a lot of imported product that was coming. However, they have now changed that, and they have rolled that quality back, and they're saying, okay, you must have EU GMP standards as of this summer. And they did put that out 2 years ago, and you're seeing a huge change now in who's supplying the Australian market, how they're supplying it, and it's suddenly becoming a huge issue that you have to take into consideration. So 2 points is always start slow, will be expensive, and assume an inconsistent regulatory requirement set as they grow as a market.
That's an interesting point the change just made. So this is an example of the regulatory burden being lower, and now it's being higher at the EU GMP in Australia. Whereas I would say for the most part, we're seeing strict regulations up front and then a broadening, opening up over time in each jurisdiction. So kind of goes the opposite to a lot of what we're seeing in the rest of aspects of cannabis. So for example, like I was talking about different conditions that you could get medical cannabis for. A lot of jurisdictions start very, very limited, and then they expand it once they learn a bit more and once the doctors get on board. So that's an interesting difference. And I think one of the other interesting parts about the global cannabis industry is how do you recruit physicians in each jurisdiction? Because they're the key to the market. If you can get them on board and get them buying into the value of medical cannabis, it's going to be a lot easier to deal with the regulator and get policies and procedures in place that make sense to the actual patients. If you get patients on board, that's great, but you still need, obviously, the physicians to cross that bridge in their brains, and that sometimes it takes a lot longer than you think. And I think physician education has always been the key aspects of globalization.
Yeah, and if you look at a medical cannabis value chain in a jurisdiction such as Germany, for a Canadian company, say, or any North American company, say, Canada's a great one because you can export from Canada quite easily. They say, well, okay, we'll get some medical reps and we'll do it like we do any pharmaceutical in Canada, and we'll get going. However, there are extremely different regulatory requirements even for a medical value chain. So, for example, in Germany, your rep has to be certified. You can't just get any good-looking male or female to visit doctors. There's a requirement and approval system for individuals who are going to be interacting with doctors. There's a high burden of rules around how you interact with a medical practitioner in Germany. Extremely quite difficult to navigate if you're not from that space. And then, of course, other members of the value chain, such as pharmacists. In Canada, pharmacists in the medical channel didn't exist because, well, quite frankly, in 2014, the federal government asked pharmacists to be involved. Pharmacist organizations told the federal government to go pound sand. Would never want anything to do with cannabis. So as a result, weird freak scenario, and I've never seen this anywhere else since. In Canada, you can actually, as a medical cannabis producer, you interact with the patient, you dispense directly to the patient. So it's quite a unique situation. And very bizarre for someone who was in a holy role where you're talking to patients who are quite ill, and they're interacting with you and have questions or complaints around the product. But go back to Germany, obviously that doesn't happen. The pharmacists are heavily involved, and in certain circumstances, the German government actually had to step in because the pharmacists were actually, once they touched it, they were adding 100% margin onto it. And when I say touch it, I literally mean they would take the cannabis out of a bigger pot and put it into a smaller pot and charge 100% markup. Or if they're really advanced, they would take extract in bulk, not much bulk, or they would actually extract there with the plant, for example, in Italy, and then they would actually just do a simple dilution and charge, several 100% markup on it. So you've got to be able to navigate quite interesting jurisdictions. And one fascinating jurisdiction is Italy, where we were operating in, and it was like, you actually had to sell the product from Canada to the Italian army. The Italian army would then attempt to extract it, which after 5 years, they have not even been able to get CO2 extraction down. I would, you can look into it, but it's quite comical. They're still trying to have problems with that. But, we drove cannabis from Germany into Italy in the back of a car and actually gave it to the we drove it to the Italian military base, and we gave, I don't know, what was it, 20, 30 kilos of cannabis to the Italian army, and they would then dispense it to pharmacies. So it was a very bizarre situation early days. So that's a small story.
I think one of the other interesting things about different jurisdictions, including Australia and Germany, is the script you get from your medical doctor in this jurisdiction says a specific strain. And then you go to your pharmacy, and if they don't have that strain, it's kind of what Shane was alluding to earlier, you can't get your cannabis unless they can find a substitution. So it's a lot like other prescription drugs that we have, in North America. Whereas, in Canada, like Shane was alluding to, the medical patients order from their licensed producer based on whatever they happen to have in stock at that time. So it does create a lot of pressure on the companies that are exporting their cannabis across to Europe, to a lot of these European countries, because if there's a crop failure or one strain just doesn't come out, doesn't reach the THC percentage it should have been, or if it's a little bit too high, suddenly you can't export that anymore. And then, you're stuck with it in Canada, you get rid of it on the medical or rec market in Canada, but your patients overseas are suddenly losing faith in your brand. So supply chain issues are very, very difficult to deal with in international cannabis.
I have literally had Germans cry on the phone to me because something was out of spec by 0.1% of THC, and we couldn't ship it to Germany. They might have shouted at Jill, but they cried with me because, it's just the way it was. But no, it was a real impact because you can only do so much. You don't want to invest too much because it's a very high-end grow that you're doing for an export to Germany. It's not, you're not pulling it from an outdoor grow like in, Southern California or something like that. That this is all indoor grow, highly maintained, full EU GMP documentation, a QMS system that would put, Pfizer to shame. You've got, auditors coming from Germany. You've got medical organizations coming from Germany. You've got constant review. It's been independently tested when it gets to Germany. It's a lot of barriers.
And it also is directly, goes against your priorities as a business if you're growing for the rec market, at least in Canada, and I think the US as well. In Canada, there's definitely a race for the highest THC possible because that's what the provincial regulators are buying. So can you imagine this, if you're a business that has their, your certain strain growing over here that can't go over 18%, it's 18.2, it's too high, but yet the other batch needs to be 28% to sell. So it creates a whole logistics type of nightmare.
Yeah. I think on the medical side as well, what's fascinating is that you're seeing quite a bit of complication. Where does CBD play into all of this? From a perspective of Canada, you can go to many jurisdictions around the world and you can see CBD being, sold here. Being sold in other jurisdictions as well. UK, for example, in vape pens. You can do quite a lot of work around that. But your problems of getting market access are twofold. It's the importers and it's the exporters. So in Canada, we can't import US derived CBD from hemp, even for medical. And you'll giggle why, because the regulator says we don't trust the quality coming out of the US. Because, yes, legally you can, but we won't let you do that. Now, whether that is protectionism, which I firmly believe it is, that's a huge issue. We had actually proposed when the hemp bill passed, we said, well, this is great because maybe we can get, CBD per kilo down here was like $600 at the time. And in Canada, it was $1,000 a kilo for CBD isolate. And we were saying, hang on a minute, can we just bring in CBD from the US just to our medical side? And the federal regulator said no. So you see a lot of strange situations, and that's just one example of inbound, but you see some incoherent regulatory frameworks across the world. Ireland is a great example where you're allowed to import, let's take Denmark. Denmark's a great example. You're allowed to import anything under the system they had, which was technically a pilot project. A lot of pilot projects in medical. You were able to import that if you had it on the market in your own jurisdiction. So I know companies who wanted to do that, and they just made up a SKU and they sold it to one person in their medical regime in Canada, and then they were able to, sign an attestation to the Danish government saying, yes, it's on the market in Canada, and then it ticks the box. So, it's not obvious that you can, simply just move product. There's a whole set of requirements around the medical import-export side of things, and even for the non-medical side of things.
I think that's important to note also, is the medical regime, it can be very profitable. Typically the price per gram is higher than it is on the non-medical markets, but it's also very expensive because of all these rules and regulations, and little things pop up. So if there's any advice that I think I have for anyone wanting to get into the global market is expect the unexpected and expect things to change. They're not necessarily going to know things are going to change, and that's just kind of the way it seems to happen.
Yeah, I would add to that on the medical side, I'd certainly say that you need to have very good partners in your jurisdictions. And as we all know in North America, it's very hard to find good partners in the cannabis industry because you're only as good as your last deal, your last reputational impact, or whatever the case may be. Certainly, being able to navigate good operators and understand who's who in the North American market, because we had the same thing when we were exploring the US market. Who do we partner with? Who's the good operators? You talk to, it's hard. There's currency in being a good operator. And as a result, that same thing applies in the medical side when you go to other jurisdictions. Especially when I would be very hesitant and very careful around operating. We can talk about this on the rec side when we talk about it, in what I would call developing. I don't like to use developing countries, but countries that are potentially more open to corruption. Thank you. Yeah. We've seen that issue quite a bit. You've seen reports about African medical cannabis grows, other jurisdictions, not to pick out Africa, but, Thailand, and I'm going to touch on that shortly. You've got to be very, very careful who you're dealing with on the receiving side, who are your partners, because you do need good partners. It's going to be really critical that you find those partners that you can rely on, that you can trust, that you can individually and independently verify. It's going to be really important because you're only as good as those people on the ground. And I think, Jill, trying to figure out who's the best, and who you can trust is a real challenge.
So this is an anecdote from a number of years ago, but we were looking at Mexico, and no offense to anyone who's done any business in Mexico or is planning on it. But the business partner we had on the other side was telling me about, we just had to stay out of the Mexican cartel's way, and as long as we did that, we'd be okay. And of course, I'm like, what are you talking about? He said, don't worry, Jill, the Mexican army will protect you. And of course, I was on the phone with him, protect me, from what? What does this mean? So then I had to go back and talk to our CEO and the chairman of the board and that type of thing. Do we really know what we're getting into here? And we ended up not doing that deal because, again, it was more of a regulatory issue than anything else. But it kind of really made me realize, what are we talking about here, and where are we actually going, and do we really want to be in some of these markets, right? It was a bit of an eye-opener for me when they said that the Mexican army would protect me from the cartel. So, okay, I'm not going to Mexico anytime soon at that point because I just wasn't going down there for business, but it was a little bit eye-opening.
Yeah, and it's not just Mexico.
No.
I'm Irish. We did a deal in Ireland. We were getting product into Ireland, and we only did it, because I knew who to deal with, and because I'm Irish. My wife's Israeli. There's lots of opportunity in Israel for medical marijuana. I would not do business with my wife's family. There you go. I said it. Nothing to do with whether they're Israeli or not. It's just there you go. It's certainly it's super important to be able to have that understanding of what you're going into, and that your norms in North America may not be the same norms in the jurisdictions you're trying to get into. The other issue, I think, that's probably worth noting in Canada anyway, we've got federal regulation that will overview and manage your dealings with in other countries. So there's federal ethical regulations. I don't, I've been briefed on it. I know it. It's been a while, but Jill, maybe you can speak to that. That there's a your business practices responsibility back home, and that you can be held accountable fully for those.
Do you want to talk about the rec market?
Yeah, my favorite. So I think the rec market is an extension of the medical very often as you see that. There's a few exceptions to that. Thailand is a great example where 10 years ago, you'd be very hesitant to be caught with drugs in that neighborhood at all. But now you see ministers of health and prime ministers, openly canvassing with guys dressed in big marijuana leaves, and unfortunately, it's a little bit of a wild west. Now, I spent quite a bit of time in Thailand. We worked with the Thai FDA, a very advanced group of people, great group of people. But it's just, again, to drill home on, it's very hard to understand how things are going to operate in your market. So if you're investing time, effort, money, people, and potentially product going to these jurisdictions, it's very important that you actually spend the time, do the homework, build a strategy. I would recommend going slow and starting small. Get a beachhead. That's the best advice I can give, because you can lose control of your brand or your products very, very quickly in those situations. And certainly, I've seen, not just Thailand, but other jurisdictions where on the rec side, there's a lot of money to be made very quickly by people who want to get in early and get out early. And that's a challenge if you're a long-term business or a brand that wants to do, multi-year, decade kind of strategy. So that's something to be very wary of in those spaces.
And it often requires domestic cultivation in the rec markets as well, because a lot of exports can only be made for medical purposes or research. So it can be a very big investment to, build your flagship location and cultivate in each jurisdiction. It's obviously a huge decision for any business.
Yeah, like looking at the evolution of rec, very often you're going to see, it's starting very slowly with medical. And honestly, let's look at rec development in Canada for a second. I know there's a ton of this, but, I was working in the cannabis industry prior to Canadian federal recreational laws, and there was no group more surprised to see federal regulation happen so quick for recreational use in Canada than those that were in the medical space. We could not believe our luck, and we could not believe now the mountain that we had to climb to be able to take something that was this size, that was, built for a certain population of medical patients, and then go to 30 million people or whatever percentage of users will that, which no one could tell us how much that would be. So the point is that you will see in regulatory policy a concept called punctuated equilibrium. It's not everyone thinks, it's a straight line. Policy, will develop to get more confidence. The precautionary principle will be applied, and then they'll gradually. No, very often it's steps. You get opportunities to be able to, open the regulatory door or the window, as the case may be, and then you push open the door. But you certainly don't see a logical kind of, we're going to start here, we're going to develop. And Germany's a great example of that. You've seen a growing medical industry, and then you've seen the German government absolutely tie themselves in knots about what they're doing, how they're doing it. Let's talk to the EU Commission. I'm Irish, we practically run the EU Commission, it's true, especially on the ag side. But I can tell you, the EU Commission organization going, why are they even talking to us about this? This is embarrassing. So I think, be very wary of commercial announcements of companies who are going to do very well in rec, and be even more wary of political announcements or, ideas or concepts that will be floated by certain jurisdictions for recreation, because they may sound like they're 5, 10 years away, but they could be 20, 30 years away. But more likely, it will be quick when it happens, but as a result, you need to be ready.
So we might sound a little bit pessimistic when we're kind of telling you about all the issues that could come up, but I truly believe that there is obviously a huge opportunity on the global cannabis market, whether that's medical or non-medical. I think a lot of the companies that exist today are challenged to take advantage of that for one main reason. They're either publicly traded and they're focused on having to deliver results quarter by quarter, or they're going to lose their investors, or they've got some sort of private equity money that's trying to put pressure on them for very quick profits and show me the results now. Investors have been in the cannabis space for a number of years. The ones that are still there, a lot of them are saying, do something or I'm going to pull my money. If you had the right money that was patient and you could wait another 5 years or so, there's going to be a lot of opportunities. But I don't know of many companies that have that ability to wait that long.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The other aspect I would say is that on the recreational side, I think it's the story that the U.S. has to tell, even at the state level, And the folks in this room who have been heavily involved in all the, painful labor of love of developing regulations and getting it through elected officials and turning, concepts into law and operationally, successful regulations. The rest of the world is looking at your jurisdictions and they're looking at you specifically. I think it's super important that you can go out there and tell that story both to investors and to, more importantly, to the regulators and the elected officials in those jurisdictions. Because you have to understand, when I talk to regulators around the world, they're going, well, first of all, they go, and this has been told to me by Canadian officials when they visit the UN for the UN drug conversations, other countries come up to them and go, why are you regulating? Now we have to do work. Now we have to explain why we aren't regulating recreational use. So there is an inherent comfortableness with doing nothing in many bureaucracies because it means less work. And the other side of it is, where's the political will to do something? And some people, you need to see that, what's the win-win for the elected official? And who usually thinks in 4 or 5 year increments, not in 10, 15, 20 years. And they really don't care about whether something is right or wrong or, justice. They're looking at their next election cycle. I hate to be pessimistic with that, but that's the reality you're dealing with. But nevertheless, I think lawyers in particular and people in this room have a great opportunity to describe what success looks like, or even what success shouldn't look like, to help those who are considering it, to making it easier. Because if you can paint a picture of success and that you can show the sky hasn't fallen and that that a system can work and a regulated system can work, it's a huge win. And never underestimate your biggest friend in those rooms is the Department of Finance guy or girl in the room. Because the conversations I've had around the world, and I've been lucky enough to have them, it's always that person that says, okay, listen, we'll level with you. We are seeing reduction in excise and tax duty from alcohol. People are drinking less. We're seeing loss in in gasoline or petrol revenue as well for excise. We are seeing loss in tobacco excise. So they're constantly being cut. This opportunity to bring in a regulated new product, the first time in 40, 50 years for new excise revenue, is very exciting to those tax people in government because they're seeing less revenues, but they're seeing more outlay for a population that's getting older, more stress on the financial system for the country. So they're the people who are actually behind the scenes going, we should seriously look at this because this is one of the last times that we'll be able to actually get a new revenue stream. That works.
Yeah. Questions?
Yeah, I think we'd open it up to questions because we also know that if we end early, you'll like us a lot because there's alcohol and cannabis on the other side of the doors. So we'd like to give you the ability to ask some questions, and otherwise we could talk for several days. Yeah.
When you talk to regulators from any of the 40, 50 other countries around the world that have legalized cannabis in some form, especially medical, what's their view of the way the U.S. handles the market, considering the biggest marketplace is in the U.S., yet we're the one country that obviously can't figure out how to do it, regulated on a federalized level. So I'm curious, what are the Canadian regulators, what are the European regulators that you're seeing? What do they say about the U.S.? Aside from we're all fat backwards.
Well, I'll give that a shot. I think they don't really understand. They don't really understand the split between state and feds. Honestly, I don't think a lot of Americans understand that either, right? So, we saw that in in Canada we have the same issue with provincial feds. Like if you ask Joe or Joanne Smith on the street who regulates what, it's like, I don't know, I just know it's legal. And they'll just buy a legal product because it's all legal. So I think there's a lot of interest in the markets. I think the issue that concerns when I talk to regulators around about the US, it's like it's the lack of banking, it's the cash business side of things that I think has in the past freaked them out a lot because no one wants that amount of cash moving around. And it seems like the FDA is a huge standard, right? And the fact that the FDA won't get involved for an outsider doesn't seem to make much sense now. I understand completely why, but from a regulator perspective, it's kind of like, okay.
If you do, can you explain to the rest of us, because most of us don't understand why?
I think it comes down to the state side of things, right? Like, we could have a chat about that for some time.
I also think that, a lot of jurisdictions don't necessarily understand that when the U.S., if and when the U.S. does federally, come together on one, legalization plan, that's going to change global cannabis forever. And we don't know how it's going to, but it opens up a lot of doors probably in terms of, international treaties will have to change. Exporting cannabis should become easier in a lot of places. It upsets the whole playing field. So as much as, as an outsider to America could say, well, the U.S. needs to legalize and basically, for lack of a better term, get shit together, it's also a little bit scary for some of the international companies. And if it's not, it probably should be for a lot of reasons, right? And you're going to see a lot of the, obviously, bigger players come in. The non-cannabis players right now, they're kind of waiting in the wings. Suddenly they come in with their money. It's a small amount of time. We don't know how many years we have for the companies that exist now to basically get a foothold so they can either continue to exist or be acquired. But it's going to change everything.
Yeah. And just on that, I think when I talk to some of the bigger players, just for giggles, I would highly recommend everyone to Google BT Ventures website and see who they're investing in the space. So this is British American Tobacco. They have a venture wing, and it's quite fascinating who they're placing bets with, and that's all publicly available. I think some of the bigger players certainly are waiting to see what happens federally, and they don't. They certainly are leveraging all their connections that they would have as a regulated industry. They've got quite a strong network in Washington, D.C., at state capital levels. So certainly I think there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes on that front. If you look at what their headquarters are doing, for example, take BAT out of London, while they obviously have U.S. connections. I think it's quite interesting to see who they're investing in, and there is operators that they're investing here in the U.S.
Outside of North America, is there a particular country who has handled this entree into legalization well, in your opinion? And I ask that because it is only at this conference where I get to pick the brains of lawyers who are regularly engaged in this practice area outside of the U.S. because we can talk about the wild, wild west from Michigan to Illinois. I mean, that just those two states alone would, take up a few days. But I just wonder, outside of the silo that some of us live in, what's happening in the world at large. And if somebody's getting it close to right.
I think Shannon and I are both pessimistic. Because we've seen, there absolutely are jurisdictions. Like, I think Canada's done a lot of things well. There's a lot further to go. That's probably the best example of, rec and medical, obviously, in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
But
I think simple answer is no one's doing it well, and I might be a regulatory policy snob.
you are 100%.
Because I wrote regulations, and I was in the bureaucracy, and I worked with cabinet in Canada, and so I have a very high standard of expectations of if you're going to do regulation, just do it right, take your time, and get it right. And there's, best practices, best concepts, but very often that's not how it's done, right? And I tend to agree. I think if you're looking for, look, it's the only top two will be Uruguay and Canada, right? Uruguay's product is terrible, I hear, and it's not a great. It's a very, there's some problems there.
It's a very closed system, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an extremely closed system.
We're also thinking about this from a business perspective too. When you say who did it well, like we're thinking of all the issues that have come up for us over the years. Like regulations don't make sense, whereas the governments probably think they're doing a great job because they don't care about the business side.
Isn't that subjective though? What's right and what's well? Because I mean, like, you look at a lot of the Central and South American governments, they operate by fiat. Whatever provincial governor or president's in place will just change the policy then. You look at Australia and they said, well, this is purely pharmaceutical, we're going to treat it that way. So isn't it somewhat a subjective question of who's right and well? Because I'm sure in Colombia they think that they've done it right and well, and in Canada they're going, well, no, Colombia did it terribly, we did it right and well.
So Zach, on your point, yes, that is, the question was convoluted, but she actually answered it, because what I didn't realize I was asking is what's more business friendly, and that's what I was thinking of.
So we can find problems everywhere on the business side, right?
Yeah.
Not to down your question.
Yeah.
I would argue there, if you go to the OECD, there's very clear guidance on what makes good regulation. Like, there's an entire field of study on regulatory design, regulatory making, regulatory implementation, smart regulation, good for business, cost, benefit, impact analysis. I can go on ad nauseam. And Canada was a leader in that, and is a leader in that space. However, if you look at the Canadian regulatory policy development around recreational cannabis, well, actually, no, if you look at the medical side, they were dragged kicking and screaming into medical, like by very brave people who took them to court and won. So they were dragged kicking and screaming. Where business got involved in Canada, the medical cannabis side, and I know I'm going to touch on this, but it's just to give you some insights, it was under the Conservative government when they came in, and there was already a pre-existing medical space where Canada was growing medical cannabis in a mine on contract in the middle of Saskatchewan, in the middle of nowhere. And that didn't upset the Conservatives as much as the fact that the federal government was losing $5 million a year doing it. That drove them crazy. They said, hang on a minute, we're selling cannabis, we're selling dope. For Conservatives, we don't agree with that, but we're doing it at a loss to the taxpayer? Are you? Okay, so then they said, we're out. And they brought in private companies to do that. And that's where the medical space came from. So it was reactionary. It wasn't well thought out, and they were taught, the idea of edibles and extracts was then allowed because of people bringing people to court. But when it came to recreational, I would argue, it was one of the worst regulatory making processes Canada has ever done. I spent 7 years managing regulatory development in Canada, and it was one of the worst. They didn't even pre-publish the regulations for comment. Right? It was done so fast. And the poor bureaucrats, like I'm friends with them, they were up in the middle of the night, they were writing, there were drafters. In Canada, French and English drafters are attached to the hip, they go around together, they have coffee together, it's hilarious to watch them draft. They were doing like crazy hours. There was a huge push to get this done by a certain date because the Prime Minister wanted it done, and this was a new theory that they had developed, was deliverology, everything was tick boxing, how quickly could you get things done? And they didn't even pre-publish it. This is now an industry that's worth 4.2 billion Canadian dollars in retail, and they didn't pre-publish the regulations. And now we're dealing with what I would argue badly worded regulations, badly interpreted questions. So if Canada can get it done so badly, the question is, I think, I don't have much hope for people to develop good regulations unless they learn from, US state regulatory frameworks. which I think have evolved and are constantly evolving, or they look at Canadians and learn the mistakes that were done and don't redo it. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, got it.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right.